There has been a lot of news about the increasing heat that we're seeing around the world. Climate change is probably the most that climate change has been at the forefront of the news since the last El Nino slash blob event in 2013 to 2016, and it's pretty scary. And although we're seeing some effects, we're seeing like the droughts leading to wildfires, we're seeing the prediction of increasing storms and increased typhoon activity this summer and potentially coming up this fall. We're not really seeing a lot of the effects or having a lot of the information for the effects of what's happening under the sea. And we're going to talk about that today, of effects that have kind of been a result in the snow crab population in Alaska. There's been the result of, over a decade of warming or more in a place that is fairly vulnerable to changes in the Arctic Sea and the Bering Sea. So we're going to talk about that today, what's happened with the snow crab population, how it's affecting a local community, and what that means for fisheries in the future. We're going to talk about that on this episode of How to Protect the Ocean. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I am your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. Just wanted to let people know before we get into this episode, I've started a bit of a series called Under the Sea with me on TikTok. I've been trying to figure out what content I want to do for that platform, for the TikTok platform. And with the time that I have working a full-time job, being a dad and all that kind of stuff, I've tried to come up with ways to create something that's on the fly, as the short form content platforms are really about. And so what I've done is I've created this bit of a news show, Under the Sea with me, where I just talk about the latest news that I've read that day. And sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 3 episodes or 3 pieces of content per day, and I'll post them throughout the day. But if you want to check that out, you can go to my TikTok account and check it out, just to see, like, if you want to just kind of stay happening. A lot of times I don't have the ability to do this on my, like, to put out a podcast every day and go through those motions every day and go through that process, I should say. So the TikTok is it's quick hitting. It's not a lot of graphics, or any graphics really, other than just me. Sometimes if there's a video available, I'll do that. But essentially, I'm at Speak Up for Blue. That's my company's name, at Speak Up for Blue. You can check that out on TikTok. And just let me know what you think. Drop a comment on some of the videos about the video, and let me know what you think of the videos. You can also hit me up on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean, and we'll go from there, and just let me know what you think of the overall sort of series. It's something I've just wanted to do for a while. I'm on the platform quite a bit, and it's an interesting thing. So I'll probably do an episode just sort of on what I've found, like after a month or so, just to see, and maybe after 6 months, just to see what my experience has been on TikTok. But so far it's been quite interesting. It's something that I'm able to do in terms of a production standpoint, and that makes me feel good when I put it out. So that's what we're going to do. A lot of times now I just put out, for the time being, I was putting out sort of clips from episodes with interviews and stuff. I also have Beyond Jaws on there, but I decided to make one account for all the podcasts that we have at Speak Up for Blue, and like How to Protect the Ocean, Beyond Jaws, and then put out those clips. But now I want to do a little bit more of a series of me talking about the ocean and the news that's happening in the ocean. Speaking of which, news happening today, and I mean great, and it's always great when you have articles from Hackeye Magazine. If you go to hackeyemagazine.com, or you just click the link in the show notes, you'll be able to see this article that we're going to be covering today. They titled it, How Ocean Warming is Killing a Prime Alaska Crab Fishery. And essentially they start off, for the Aleut community of St. Paul, Alaska, the loss of snow crab is rippling through the economy and raising concerns about the future. A wonderful episode that really humanizes the effect of a collapse or potential collapse of a population Essentially, the story goes St. Paul Island in Alaska, very small community, about 500 people, essentially a village. It employs over 400 seasonal workers at a snow crab factory that it has, and all of its sort of related activities is the main source of revenue for that. So from the city point of view, it's a big revenue generator. Without that, they can't survive for very long. In terms of the government there, the local government there cannot survive in paying for the services that require to run St. Paul. And so they're concerned right now. Now, they have built in reserves in terms of finances to help them in years like this, where the seasonal quota has actually been canceled. You can't go out and get snow crab these days because the NOAA Alaska Fisheries Center has basically said it's closed. There's not enough snow crab to make it it's not viable right now, and so there's no quotas, there's no going out, and you're not going to be able to have snow crab this year. So they were not going to be able to sell it. So a lot of fishers are out of work right now for snow crab, and then there's been a lot of other things that have been going on, which we'll go through. But this is a big thing for St. Paul. It's a big thing for Alaska. It's sort of it's a tale of what's been happening and a result of what's been happening over the last few decades, especially over the last decade with the blob, which I'll explain in a second, as well as El Nino in 2016, which I'll also explain in a second, and the ramifications of that warming weather that we've seen, especially over the last decade. And this is sort of a result of that, is just, fisheries populations, like whether it's shellfish, whether it's fish, they can only handle a certain amount of change, especially in an area that doesn't usually undergo through that much change in like an Arctic area. It's supposed to be cold water. And so if the water's cold and there's lots of ice, then you're going to get healthy populations. If there's not a lot of ice and it's warming, those populations are going to disappear. Whether they disappear because they all die off or they shift north, is something to be seen. But right at this point, we're seeing a decrease in the snow crab population, which is a pretty big population for the St. Paul community, as well as other communities, around Alaska, the coast of Alaska. And so we want to make sure that we continue to see a sustainable population, but with weather the way it's going and climate the way it's going right now, we're just continuing to see this increased warming. Very, very scary from a point of view of, if you're a fisher in the St. Paul area. So, like I said, the snow crab season was canceled this year due to low stock assessment. The main driver, they're saying, has been an increase in heat. Now, the heat started in around 2013 when we saw a warming of the North Pacific Ocean, where it was Eastern Pacific, I guess, where there was just this massive blob of heat, and it wasn't going anywhere. And then El Nino started in 2016, and that's where, we saw the blob and El Nino kind of mix in a little bit. And so what El Nino does, it changes the weather. It's sort of like it's sort of like a South Pacific sort of weather system, I guess, or current system. And essentially when it's in El Nino, it switches that system and it makes it warm across the Pacific and the North Pacific, South Pacific and North Pacific. And then sometimes you'll see a shifting in seas. So you see warmer tropical species from the south, like near South America, come up north, further north, like into North America areas, like in the Eastern Pacific, along the North American coast. And then, so we continue to see that heat, and usually that lasts a couple of years. And so, just for an example, we just recently started an El Nino. And so that El Nino population, or that El Nino sort of system, has really changed the weather this year, if you've noticed. In Ontario, we usually get really, really hot and wet summers. And that is what we've been having to a T. We get probably 2-3 days a week of intense weather, like intense storms. We've seen more tornadoes in the area. Nothing like crazy damaging, but we've seen a bit of flooding here and there. But we've seen a lot of rain, and it's been crazy hot, like humid hot in Ontario, which is normal for humidity, but just constant. It's just constant, 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 constant. And so, we're getting that El Nino kind of effect, and that's happening across North America right now, and in the Pacific Ocean, and that's a crazy thing. So, having those coupled back then in 2013 and 2016 has really affected that. We've started to see increased sea surface temperature across the Eastern Pacific Ocean. We started to see changes. We were worried about changes in populations. Boom and bust populations like snow crab were really being affected more to the extreme of the bust. And so increasingly, the changes in other species populations have definitely changed in specific areas, even on the Atlantic, in the northwestern Atlantic, on the east coast of the North America landmass. We've definitely seen population shift more north to get into cooler waters, and we've seen that on North Atlantic. We've seen cod, we've seen haddock and halibut kind of shift north. On the western front, we've also seen fish shift north. And when that happens, you're almost getting like a new species into areas that you've never seen these species before. And when you see that, they're going to take advantage of the food that's in there. And that's one of the things that they're saying that has affected the snow crab population. Now, here's kind of running through the list of how the heat affects the snow crab population. First of all, you have shifting currents with increased heat. So as the heat increases, it increases the atmosphere air. There's only so much that the ocean can absorb, and the ocean has absorbed 90% of the atmosphere's heat. So it's holding a lot of heat. So that's why we're seeing a lot of evaporation. That's where you see a lot more intense storms. But what you're also seeing is that changes currents, and it changes the wind, which can change the direction of currents. And so we're seeing shifting currents with increasing heat. That could change a lot in terms of the recruitment. Quick story: when I was doing my master's, my supervisor and I came across a paper that was done by Dr. Paul Snellgrove at Memorial University that looked at the recruitment of different species, invertebrate and fish species, that had sort of a recruitment phase where they released eggs and they would go into the water column, and then they develop into larvae and things like that, and they would go into the water column and they would recruit somewhere else. And that was part of a system, that replenished certain areas. So you had like sources and sinks of larvae. So the sources would be the areas where it would be recruitment or would be spawning areas, and then that area that would they would let the larvae go, or the eggs go and turn into larvae, and then it would go into the water column. The currents would bring them into these sink areas where you would just see these larvae sort of settle. And that would be their area where they would go as a juvenile. Maybe they'd shift somewhere else as an adult for their adult stage. And, we were looking at this for a potential PhD for me, and looking at what are the recruitments of invertebrate species, because I was doing a master's on invertebrate species, and where are they going to end up, and how could that change? And we were going to use a number of different predictive models of currents and where we think these animals are going to land, and how that would affect how we put together a network of marine protected areas that are all connected biologically. So, I could probably do a whole episode. I've talked about this type of stuff in the past. But, when you talk about currents, this is where it becomes important. When you're looking at management, you're looking at planning, you're looking at prediction of where these animals are going to settle based on how long their larval period is. How far can they go with that distance? There's a lot that goes into it, a lot of variables that go into where they're going to settle and how long they're going to carry into the currents, and where those currents are going to go. If they shift because the wind shifts, because the atmosphere and the ocean heat is switching the winds and the currents are changing, then that recruitment, that source or that sink is different. And so we could be seeing, my hypothesis is we could be seeing a different sink, a different area where these larvae are going to sit and recruit and just being in a different area because of a different current system. That could happen in the future. I'm not saying that's exactly what's happening now, but as I was reading this article from Hakai Magazine, that's something that I thought, man, that could happen big time. and I'm seeing, that's my prediction of what's happening if these currents are shifting or if they're going to shift in the future because of this increased heat. So, with that kind of shifting, that recruitment is shifted, then where these snow crab fishers are going to go, they may have to find where they are and where they're going to go based on these predictions. So it'll be interesting to see what NOAA comes out with this in the future, to see if they have shifted populations or if they're just dying. Snow crabs' metabolic rates are very tied to the temperature of the water. The more ice cover and the colder the water is, like 1.7 degrees or below, the better the snow crab population does. So if we're seeing like an increase, even in a couple of degrees, then that could actually negatively impact the snow crab population. And so when you have like an increased temperature, it just shifts. The metabolic rate shifts. So if it's increased temperature, it gets slower. It doesn't eat properly. If it goes over 12 degrees, the snow crabs stop eating. Not saying that Arctic and Alaskan waters are getting to over 12 degrees, but that's kind of what we're looking at for snow crabs, in that as temperature increases, they don't do well, right? And so we're seeing that. Now, what we're also seeing too is there's been this sort of, not phenomenon, but just not even discovery, but more understanding of bottom heat waves. We see sea surface temperature heat waves, right? Because that's what we can measure quite easily through satellite imagery. But when you're looking at you look at the bottom of the water column, and throughout the water column, there's an increase in heat. And depending on how things mix in the water column, we can see that heat increase staying in the bottom if there's no way for it to mix. And so what we're doing is we're seeing that. And a lot of the times the heat at the bottom is relative to the heat at the top, at the surface, but it's not always the case. You can have a heat wave at the bottom without having a heat wave at the surface, and we may not know unless we're actually measuring at that specific time in that specific place. So that can be variable, and that makes it very difficult to manage populations, to understand, how a population is doing based on temperature. It'll require a lot more monitoring and research there. I don't know if a buoy system could be put in those areas to find out what's going to happen in that area. Of course, when over the last 10 years, we've seen algal blooms in the Arctic because of the increased heat. We know what happens with algal blooms. It can affect not only just everything at the surface, but it can affect, as that algal bloom dies, it can affect things at the bottom, depending on how things are moving, what the oxygen levels are, and so forth. We know that could be a big problem. We've seen that happen in Alaskan waters. Also, snow crab is a pulse fishery, which means, like I mentioned earlier, it's boom or bust. But lately it seems more bust than boom. 1 year, other species of crab populations decreased, and haddock and other fish decreased. And they were like, wow, like that's kind of crazy how everything else is decreasing. But there were a lot more, young crabs that were born, that were actually there in sort of a quote unquote baby form, than there were of other species. And so they expected the snow crab population, that sort of snow crab population, to grow into adults. It never happened though. They died off the next year for whatever reason. Heat, predation, we don't know. And so they never grew into juveniles or adults. We never really saw them. And that's kind of led to this sort of collapse this year, and saying, hey, the population is temporary collapse. We don't know where they are. We haven't seen them. The stock assessment has just said is pulling in nothing. And so we're just going to cancel the season because from a management perspective, this is the best thing for it. You could probably find some snow crab, but you're not going to get the yield you want. It's not going to be profitable. It will probably go into debt because of it, because of all the costs that go into it. And so we're just going to kind of close it down. Now, the other thing too that could have happened to those smaller crabs is some predators might be shifting in their distribution, just like we talked about the potential shift in crab population. And so as things heat up and animals that need cold water shift northward to get into cooler water, they might be finding in a certain area and be like, hey, yum, there's a crab population here that we're going to take advantage of, and they're going to take advantage of that population, and they're going to eat it. And that's what might be happening in this area as well. There's nothing that's saying for sure that, it's increased predation, has to do with heat. We know heat is having an effect. We just don't know exactly how. There's a lot more research that needs to be done. But just based on a lot of the things that I listed, it explains a lot for a crab population that has been decimated over the last decade, slowly. And that's the thing with heat, is we're seeing that as heat continues to increase. And let's get this straight. It is continuing to increase. There's some variability here, but it is continuing to increase. And we're getting more heat waves on the surface and potentially on the bottom of the ocean in certain areas than we've had before. And so to be able to adapt and recover from these, the big thing is we really need to reduce our greenhouse gases. We need to do it faster. And this is why scientists are saying that we're in a climate emergency. This is why we're seeing this. Now, I posted a video, to talk about my TikTok videos that I was talking about earlier. I posted my first video was talking about the heat and how we're seeing an increased heat in just an increased heat. Like we're seeing 100-degree Fahrenheit water. And you're just like, you got to be kidding me. That's like a hot tub water, and 100-degree Fahrenheit. And we're seeing that off the coast of Florida. And I posted a video on that just to let people know that's what we're seeing and what that could mean. And somebody replied, like one of the first people to reply was somebody who's like, oh, well, there's this guy, all these numbers are being over exaggerated and, people are making too big of a deal of this because you should watch this video. You should watch this video of this guy saying that, a lot of the data has been, politicized and made extreme so that, that people are scared and then people are more controlled. Ignoring all the other science papers. I said, he goes, where's your science? And I'm like, look, I am done proving the science that climate change is happening, it's man-made, and that we need to be careful of this and we need to change our ways. It's not up to me to tell people what the science is. There are plenty, and I mean thousands and thousands and thousands of scientific journal articles, peer-reviewed journal articles that have been out there that show the effects over and over and over that are due to climate change. And this is what we're seeing here. We're still seeing the ignorance. We're still seeing that, hey, there's this one guy in a video that says that says, all these numbers are extreme, but they're going to believe that person who may or may not be a scientist over all the other scientists, 97% of the scientists who are saying, yes, this is happening. We're seeing it in our daily science. Like even just go into the marine biology literature, and over the last 10 years, over the last 20 years, and you start hearing that there's talk of climate change every single time. There's talk of like the effects of climate change every single time. They're everywhere. And so when people tell me, well, where's your science? I'm like, just look it up. Like Google search it. Google Scholar is your friend. Look it up. Read it. And actually have an open mind when you read it, because this is straight up facts. Straight up facts. It's not into some guy's opinion that's put out in a video, and that it gets extremely frustrating when we're in the situation that we're in. We want to be realistic about this. People are being affected by this every single day. Even now, as you're listening to this, people are affected by climate change. Some more than others. Some it's life and death. Some it's like, how am I going to pay my bills? Like this St. Paul, Alaska community, right? And a lot of the times it's the small communities, especially the small island communities or the developing country communities that are being affected by this information. We do not have the time to argue whether this is real or not or what's causing. We do not even have the time to act. We need to act yesterday. And that's just where it comes down to it, right? And so that is my call to action to you, is do everything you can to reduce your footprint. Do everything you can to vote in people in your government who are going to act for climate change, like to reduce climate change, right? None of this denial stuff. Like the time for games is over. It's been over for a long time. We need to get people in office that are actually going to do something about it. And when you look at it, it's like, who's going to do the most? Who's going to do the most? Right? Because I see people still in Canada. They look at our current government and they're like, they're not doing anything. This carbon tax is, it's a crock. It doesn't do anything. And I agree, there's a lot of these programs that they need to be more transparent. They need to tell us what they're doing with the money and all this kind of stuff. But the people who are going to replace them one day or are trying to replace them have no plan. No plan. And it drives me nuts how in 2023, a political party that's trying to get into government has no plan for climate change, and almost to go to the opposite end and drive climate change further. So that's the call to action, is make yourself aware and then act, right? Act through voting, act through, the research on each political member, not even just the party, but the political member that you're voting for or that you're considering, and then act. Act. That's the biggest thing. And that's my rant for today, along with the news. Anyway, that's it for today. Head over to the show notes and just look. It's on the app that you're listening to this podcast. All you have to do is click on the link in the show notes. They'll take you to the actual article on Hackeye Magazine. Great website. It's just a great journalist there. Always put out some strong articles. This was done by Andrew Lewin. Very, very good, and I highly recommend. But that's it for today's episode. If you want to get in touch with me and you have comments about anything that I've said or the news about this and the crabfish, or you know more about this, please, you can hit me up on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. And don't forget, you can go follow me on TikTok at Speak Up for Blue. So 2 different places, 2 different accounts. But hopefully it's not too confusing. But anyway, that's it for today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.